In 1955, Richard Sanders still kept his father's last letter on his nightstand, a faded promise to be home by Christmas of '39. The Army had declared Sergeant James Sanders and his entire recon platoon lost during a training exercise in the remote Nevada desert, a footnote in pre-war history. But when a rancher reports finding a strange, corroded vent on a hillside miles from any known military base, Richard feels a jolt of hope he hasn't felt in 16 years, convinced this forgotten piece of metal is the key to uncovering why his father's unit never came home. What follows is a search for truth that proved a father's love can echo through time, and that some secrets can never be buried deep enough. Stick with us as we uncover what really happened to Sergeant Sanders and his men. For 16 years, the grief had been a quiet, constant companion for Richard Sanders. It was in the empty chair at the dinner table of his childhood, in the silence when other boys talked about their fathers, and now, in his own quiet life as a high school history teacher in Ohio. He taught his students about great battles and celebrated heroes, but the story of his own father, Sergeant James Sanders, was a single, frustrating page in a file cabinet, stamped with the words, "Lost in a training accident, presumed deceased." The official story was that the platoon was caught in a sudden, violent flash flood during a recon exercise. No bodies, no equipment, no wreckage was ever found. They were simply gone, swallowed by the vast, indifferent desert. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, Richard would write a letter to the Department of the Army asking if any new information had surfaced. The reply was always the same, a polite, form letter expression of sympathy with no new leads. At 28, Richard had resigned himself to a life of not knowing. The hope he'd clung to as a boy had faded into a dull ache of acceptance. That acceptance was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The phone rang in his small home, and a gruff voice introduced himself as Sheriff Miller from a small county in Nevada. "Mr. Richard Sanders, I'm calling about an inquiry you filed regarding a Sergeant James Sanders." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. "Yes, that was my father. Has something happened?" "Well, maybe nothing," the sheriff said, his tone cautious. But a local rancher, a fellow named Thomas Hayes, was out on the northern edge of his property and found something. It's a round metal thing, like a vent, sticking out of a hillside. Looks military, but there's no record of any base ever being out there. The thing is, this part of his land hasn't been used for grazing in decades. A brush fire went through there last month and cleared away a lot of the scrub. First time anyone's had a clear look at that hill in years. When Mr. Hayes reported it, I cross-referenced it with old missing persons reports from the area. Your father's platoon was the only military unit that ever went missing out here. It's a long shot, but I figured you'd want to know. A long shot. For 16 years, Richard had survived on long shots. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't felt in years. He hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He looked at the framed photo of his father on the mantelpiece, a smiling young man in a crisp uniform, a man he barely remembered but had spent a lifetime missing. For the first time, it felt like that man might finally come home. He packed a small bag, carefully placing his father's last letters and the thin file of official Army correspondence inside. He called the school and arranged for a substitute, telling the principal it was a family emergency. In a way, it was. The oldest and most important emergency of his life. The flight to Reno and the subsequent bus ride to the dusty Nevada town felt unreal. When Richard stepped off the bus, Sheriff Miller was there to meet him. He was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes that held a hint of pity. He seemed to understand that he was dealing with a wound that had never properly healed. They drove out of town in the sheriff's patrol car, the paved road quickly giving way to a dirt track that snaked through an endless landscape of rock and scrub. Thomas Hayes has been ranching this land his whole life, just like his father before him, the sheriff explained. He says that Hillside has always been just a pile of rocks and thorns. The fire changed that, uncovered a lot of things. They arrived at the ranch and were greeted by Thomas, a sturdy man whose handshake felt like leather and stone. He led them on foot to the site. The air was still thick with the smell of burnt sagebrush. After a 10-minute hike over the scorched earth, Thomas pointed. There it is. It was exactly as the sheriff described, a round, corroded iron grate, about 2 feet in diameter, set flush against the dirt of the hillside. It was unmistakably man-made, and its design was military. Richard knelt, his fingers tracing the rusted bars. It was an air vent. But a vent for what? There was nothing else around, just miles of empty desert. There were no bases here, Richard murmured, mostly to himself. The Army was very clear about that. That's what they say, the sheriff said, scratching his jaw, but this thing here says different. Back in town, Richard used the sheriff's office to call the nearest Army base. He eventually was put through to a Colonel Robert Miller, a man with a clipped, impatient voice. Richard explained who he was and what they had found. He heard the rustling of papers over the line. Sanders? Sanders? Yes, I have the file, the colonel said. Platoon went missing in 39. Tragic accident. As for your vent, son, there have never been any permanent military installations in that specific quadrant. It's likely old mining equipment or some Depression-era public works project. I assure you it has no connection to your father's case. The dismissal was swift and absolute. Before Richard could argue, the colonel wished him well, and the line went dead. Frustration burned in Richard's chest. The vent was military. He knew it. The colonel was either lying or incompetent. That night, in his small motel room, Richard laid out his father's letters on the worn bedspread. He read them over and over, searching for a clue he might have missed. Most were about the mundane details of Army life, but one letter stood out. His father mentioned his commanding officer, a Major David Stone, describing him as ambitious as they come, and a man who keeps his cards so close to his chest, I don't think even he knows what he's holding. In another letter, he mentioned a friend, a Private Joseph Clark, who had broken his leg during a training drill and was shipped off to a hospital in Arizona just a week before our big exercise. A new thread of hope appeared. Joseph Clark wasn't with the platoon when they vanished. He had survived. Richard spent the next day at the town's small library, poring over old phone books and military registries. With the help of a kind librarian, he finally found a possible match, a Joseph Clark living in a small town just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. He booked a phone call through the motel operator, his heart pounding as he waited for the connection. An elderly man's voice answered. Hello? Mr. Joseph Clark? Richard asked, his own voice unsteady. My name is Richard Sanders. My father was Sergeant James Sanders. He served with you in 1939. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Joseph finally spoke, his voice was heavy. I remember Jimmy. Good man. I heard what happened. I'm sorry, son. Mr. Clark, Richard pleaded, the Army told us it was a training accident, a flash flood, but I found something out here in the desert, something that doesn't fit the story. I have to know, what was that big exercise my father mentioned? Joseph was quiet for another long moment. That exercise, he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, that was just a story for the folks back home. What we were really doing out there, it was a secret. Top secret. It had a name. Project Cerberus. Richard gripped the phone tighter. Project Cerberus? What was it? I don't know all the details, Joseph said. I was just a private, but it was some kind of high-priority engineering project. We were building something underground. Major Stone was in charge, and he was a real stickler for security. Told us if we breathed a word of it to anyone, we'd spend the rest of our lives in a military prison. He was dead serious. The work was hard, and the location was in the middle of nowhere. He told us the world was about to change, and what we were doing in that desert would help America stay safe. An underground project. A secret that Major Stone would do anything to protect. Richard looked at the motel wall, but he was seeing the corroded vent on that lonely hillside. It wasn't old mining equipment. It was a clue. It was the beginning of the real story. He thanked Joseph, his mind racing with the implications. The official report wasn't just incomplete, it was a lie. His father and his men hadn't been the victims of a random act of nature. They were part of a secret, and they had become a part of it forever. Armed with the knowledge of Project Cerberus, Richard returned to the site with Sheriff Miller the next morning. The desert felt different now, not just empty, but secretive. They stood before the vent, seeing it not as an isolated object, but as the visible tip of a much larger, hidden structure. If it's an air vent for a bunker, Richard reasoned, there has to be an entrance somewhere nearby. They started searching, walking in expanding circles from the vent. The ground was rocky and uneven, but after an hour of careful searching, the sheriff spotted it. Tucked against the base of a rock outcropping, almost completely covered by dirt and a displaced boulder, was the corner of a steel plate. It was a hatch, rusted shut and camouflaged by 16 years of neglect. Excitement and dread warred inside Richard. This was it, the entrance to his father's tomb. The sheriff, now fully invested, radioed back to his deputy. Get a crew with cutting torches out here, and tell them to be discreet. It took several hours for the crew to arrive. As they were setting up their equipment, a military jeep came roaring up the dirt track, kicking up a plume of dust. Colonel Robert Miller jumped out, his face a mask of fury. "Sheriff, what in the blazes do you think you're doing? This is a restricted area." "According to my maps, Colonel, this is private property owned by Mr. Hayes," Sheriff Miller said calmly, not backing down. "And I have reason to believe it may be the site of an unsolved disappearance of U.S. soldiers." "This is a matter of national security," the colonel blustered. "You are ordered to stand down." "Unless you have a federal warrant signed by a judge that says otherwise, my men are going to open that hatch," the sheriff replied, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "This is my jurisdiction." The colonel sputtered, but he had no legal ground to stand on. He stood back, arms crossed, his face grim as the crew fired up the torches. The sound of hissing flame filled the air as they began to cut through the thick, rusted steel. An hour later, with a final groan of metal, the hatch was cut free. Two men strained to pull it open, revealing a dark, square hole and a steel ladder descending into blackness. The air that rose from the opening was stale and cold, the smell of dust and time itself. Richard's heart was in his throat. The sheriff handed him a powerful flashlight. "You've come this far, son. You should be the first." Richard took a deep breath and started down the ladder, the sheriff close behind him. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a concrete-walled bunker. It was silent as a tomb. They stepped off the ladder onto the dusty floor. The beam swept across the room, revealing tables, chairs, and old radio equipment, all covered in a thick layer of dust. And then they saw them. The soldiers were sitting at their posts, some at the radio consoles, others at a planning table. They were skeletons in faded uniforms, frozen in time. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of violence. It was as if they had simply sat down and waited for an end that had come silently. Richard felt his legs weaken. He walked slowly toward the table, his light falling upon the skeletal figure in the sergeant's uniform. On the table in front of him was a leather-bound logbook. It was his father. After 16 years, he had found him. He reached out a trembling hand and opened the book. The pages were brittle, but the ink was still clear. It was his father's neat, disciplined handwriting. The last few entries told the whole story. The final entry was dated 3 days after the platoon was officially declared missing. Sergeant James Sanders wrote that the bunker's construction was finished, but in their final checks, they had discovered a catastrophic flaw, a crack in the main ceiling support beam. It was a fatal structural error. He had immediately radioed their report to Major Stone at the Surface Command Post. He described the tense silence that followed his report. Major Stone, whose career was tied to the success of this secret project, knew that a delay or a report of failure would be his ruin. Then, his father wrote, a new order came over the radio. It wasn't an order for evacuation. It was for the demolition team on the surface. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion shook the bunker. The main entrance, the only way in or out, had been sealed. They were trapped. Sergeant Sanders wrote of their attempts to radio for help, only to find the line dead. They realized with dawning horror what had happened. They hadn't been accidentally trapped. They had been deliberately buried. Major Stone had silenced them to protect his secret and his career. They were loose ends, and he had tied them in a knot of concrete and earth. The very last page wasn't an official log entry. It was a letter addressed to him. To my son Richard, it began. If you are ever reading this, it means the world has found us, and I am long gone. Know that we did our duty. Know that I thought of you until the very end. Don't let this make you bitter. Live a good life. Be a good man. That is all a father can ask. I love you, Dad. Richard closed the book, tears streaming down his face. Behind him, he heard the sheriff speaking in a low voice into his radio. Above, Colonel Miller stood in stunned silence as the truth of what had happened in 1939 was finally brought into the light. The aftermath was quiet but significant. The remains of Sergeant James Sanders and his platoon were recovered from the bunker. The official story of a training accident was retracted. At a solemn ceremony, they were buried with full military honors, their headstones bearing the inscription, "Killed in the line of duty." Their families finally had the truth. The investigation into Major David Stone, who had retired as a celebrated general and passed away peacefully years earlier, was classified, but his name was quietly removed from several military honors. For Richard, justice was secondary. What mattered was the truth. He stood at his father's new grave in the National Cemetery, the heavy burden of not knowing finally gone. It was replaced by a profound, aching pride in the father he barely knew, but had fought so hard to find, a good man who, trapped in the darkness, had spent his last moments writing a message of love to his son. The mystery was solved, a son's duty was done, and a soldier had finally, truly, come home. What do you think is the greater crime? The act of silencing the soldiers, or the decades of lies told to their families to protect a reputation? It's a tough question, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of a son's unwavering search for truth resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. We have many more stories to share about mysteries that time tried to forget.